Welcome, everyone. I'm Cynthia Franklin. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Entrepreneurship here at NYU Stern. And on behalf of Stern, the Alumni Relations team, and the Berkley Center, we're so delighted that you decided to join us during lunch hour today. We have a very special program in store for you. Before we dive into our conversation with our special guest, Ragy Thomas, I want to spend 40 seconds just telling you a little bit about the Berkley Center in case you're not familiar with us. Each year, the Berkley Center provides startup advice for 800 NYU students and alumni from all across campus who are aspiring entrepreneurs, who are designing, launching, and growing exciting companies. And we do this by providing more than $300,000 in startup funding through our accelerator and pre-accelerator programs, by offering hundreds of hours of coaching and startup advising services, by conducting scores of workshops and training programs, and by hosting dozens of topical programs with industry thought leaders and entrepreneurs. So the bottom line is we help startups anticipate and navigate the complex challenges that new ventures inevitably face. So if after you hear Ragy's inspiring story and you are moved to get your startup idea off the ground, or you're already working on a venture concept, contact us at the Berkley Center and nysternberkleycenter.com. Okay, that's my commercial. Now on to the main event. Ragy Thomas is a member of the Stern class of 2003, and about 11 years ago, he founded Sprinklr. Sprinklr is the leading customer experience management platform. It is used by some of the world's top brands, and it is a bona fide unicorn. It is valued at $2.7 billion, and what we're going to hear over the next hour or so is the story of Sprinklr, but more importantly, Ragy's journey and story about how he got to where he is today. Before we do, a little bit of housekeeping. I invite you to ask questions. I literally have pages of questions, but we invite you to submit your questions. And you can do that by clicking on the Q&A button on the top right of your page. And then you'll get an option to ask a question, and then you can put your question in there, and we'll do our best to get through your questions. So feel free to ask questions. I will take questions throughout the program, so you don't have to wait until the very end, and we'll go from there. All right, so I want you to please join me in giving Ragy Thomas, CEO of Sprinklr, and member of the class of 2003, the warmest virtual welcome that you can. So send out those good vibes virtually. So Ragy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am a huge fan of origin stories, all kinds of origin stories, but especially as it relates to startup founders. But I think the story of a company doesn't start with the company. It starts with understanding the founder and how they came to be, who they are. So I actually want to start way back and talk about you, Ragy, the child. And if you could just give us a little taste of your childhood, and where did you grow up? And I'm always curious to know whether or not founders are from entrepreneurial families or not. Where did this come from?
I have no idea. My dad. I was born in India, in a tiny southern state called Kerala. So if you're looking at India's map, you find Kerala at the southern tip, very tip, the western tip. If you go any further, you'll fall in the water. It's such a narrow state, and there's a huge mountain range on the eastern side. It's very unique. It gets a ton of rain. On the other side, on the eastern side, it's very dry. So when you look on the map, you'll see this patch of green, and that's a place I was born, and that's where originally Europeans went to buy spices many centuries ago. was born a Christian in Christians a minority in India and in Kerala, where I was born. My dad was a professor, and he taught English at a local college, and my mom worked for the government. And if you go back generations, my family's all been teachers and professors and doctors and engineers, and just very minimal or no business connection. In fact, it used to go the other way. My extended family generally looked down on people who did business and thought, entrepreneurs are people who start companies who do any kind of business are con artists, and you were just making money off someone else. And because all they knew were people who ran local shops and sold for more than what they got the product for. And so I kind of grew up in an anti-entrepreneurial environment, which is where I did my middle school. When we were growing up, my dad took up a teaching assignment in Nigeria, in Africa. So we ended up spending a few years there, and I came back. I was put in a boarding school, which I've told the story many times before. It was very definitional for me at that time. And I did my undergrad, high school, and undergrad in India, and I came to the US when I was 21. I was recruited out of college into this company that sent me to the US for work. So that's kind of brings you all up to how I'm 21, I'm in the US, I have a regular job.
Did you have a technical background, any interest in technology? I mean, you had an engineering degree, correct?
I did. I'm not. There's very little to be inspired by in my early life. I frequently think of my early life as driftwood. I'm one of those people who just knew how to be happy, how to party, how to really hang out and have a great time with friends and have a special time, um, in an extended crowd. I did get an undergrad degree, but I think it's possibly because that was the norm in India. I sometimes think if I was here, I probably would have dropped out.
Wow. So, okay. So there wasn't a grand plan, was there, for Ragy Thomas, newly minted bachelor's degree person?
No, there wasn't. In college, my excuse for partying and living a good life was I'm not going to be programming. And my undergrad was in computer science. I'm like, if I'm not going to be, I don't think I'm going to get a job, and I want a job as a programmer. And so, like, why waste time? So got busy in college with other things, and I was going to do an MBA right after school, after undergrad. But I still think it was a recruiting mistake that I got hired by one of the pretty decent companies that visited the campus. And since the job paid well, and most people around me thought it was just amazing, I'm like, okay, I think I'm going to work. And I proceeded to show up for the onboarding process and onboarding session. It was like, I think it's a 6-month onboarding process back then that the company had. And I just really vividly remember for the first time in my life being completely embarrassed by my ignorance. Like I was surrounded by amazing people who were like, gold medalists and really smart people who could do a lot of things. And I'm like, here I am. I'm a recruiting mistake. And I'm sure someone made a mistake somewhere along the way. But that's how my life got started.
Okay. So at some point, you did decide to go for your MBA and you wound up at Stern. So talk about what attracted you to Stern and a little bit about what, if anything, stood out about that experience and where you went right after.
If you go back to the late 90s and early 2000, technology boom was happening. Wall Street was going gangbusters for a protracted period of time. So Stern was the place to go, and this is where all the the Wall Street banks paid their employees to go do their MBA. And I wish I had a sexy story, and I don't. I'm going to let you all down again. Um, I have two sisters, and both of them had 2 degrees. So my mom was on my case. My son doesn't have a second degree. I'm like, Mom, you need a second degree. I'm going to go find myself one. Obviously, I had got started with companies and all that, so I couldn't do it full time. So I'm like, what's the best school around where I could go get an MBA? That's going to be worth the time. And obviously, I got really lucky. All kidding aside, right? Having NYU, um, right in the city I was in, and to be ranked where it was, to have the company and the professors was truly a blessing. I make light of it, but that's how I decided to. So it was like I think I wrote my uh, GMAT in a couple of weeks and got into stuff.
Actually, I love this story, and this is why I like origin stories. So I meet with a lot of students, current students at Stern, and there's so much hand wringing around not having everything figured out, and it's important to know that you don't have to have everything figured out at the beginning. You just need to be open to the opportunities that come your way. And sometimes things will reveal themselves. So far, so good. This is a good story, Ragy. Good story. All right. So you're at Stern. Were you like like the top of your class at Stern? Were you a great student? No.
So I am. I compulsively optimize. So one of the things I've always tried to do in life is be very clear about why am I doing this and what do I want out of everything. So most people who work with me now know I have I think a 3 or 4 page document that says working with me. And in that, I talk about this. If I'm doing anything, there are 2 questions I always ask. Number one, why am I doing it? Two, is that the most important thing for me to do right at that point in time? And that compulsive prioritization has played a significant role in my life. So when I was doing my MBA, my plan was to get a degree for sure. And my plan was to learn the basics of all the things I didn't know about broader business. And I did check both of those boxes, but I had zero ambition to be the top of the class and zero ambition to compete with anyone who wanted to be ahead in academics.
Okay, good. You graduate. Your first job out of Stern was?
So remember, I was doing this part-time. So, okay, you want to make the story a little more interesting. Picture this: I was married, I was going to school, my wife was going to school, we had a baby on the way, and I had no money.
Very interesting. Okay.
And you're commuting from Jersey. So that was the time when there was a point in my life where I actually started meditating and figuring out a lot of things. So my, my, my early 2000s, when I'm like, man, I don't know how to deal with stress, and I'm going to learn how. Um, so my career and my education kind of ran parallel paths at that time. I was already well into startups, and that's the reason why I couldn't do full time. Um, and so that period was extremely trying, but we finished it. Remember, when the going is tough, just keep going, right? And I got out of it, and life began.
Okay, got it. So here you are. You're working, have your MBA, and talk about what was happening in your life right before you began dipping your foot into the entrepreneurial pool. So while you were at Stern, you were working with startups.
Right. I was already in a startup.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take you back. My story appears very ordinary, and it should. It is. So hopefully people who haven't figured it out, haven't started, aren't feeling too bad. It's never too late to start. I woke up from my slumber when I was 25. And I'll tell you what turns me on. And each one of you has got to ask yourself, what turns you on? Turns you on may not be what turns me on. What turns me on may not turn you on. You look at my life, I'm a guy who just was deathly afraid of failure. I picked my battles very carefully, but I'm one of those guys where if I'm in a fight, you want to be on my side because I don't know how to go out of a fight losing. I go out in a body bag. So it usually makes it not very pleasant and good for people to compete with me. I feel bad for them sometimes. Uh, but that's something you need to know. I've always been afraid of failure. When I was 25, you live. I always think I was just like a kite flying, and I just not very driftwood, having fun in life and living, every moment and living life very well. I got married, and I was, 25, 26. And I woke up and said, now I'm responsible for another human being, and going to have kids, and I have to wake up. And that was the moment when, I just decided whatever I'm going to do, I'm going to start carving a path out. So the part of the story that's not light and easy is sort of um, the fierceness that comes out when something that you want is at stake. And for me, that feeling responsible was my first sort of, when I say I woke up from my slumber, that was it. I woke up and I said, you know what? That's good. I dedicated, I don't know whether it is a quarter of my life, whatever it is, I had fun. And now it's time to kind of get real. And I'm gonna, whatever the way the world is gonna measure it, I'm gonna win. And I don't want to set the rules. I just want to learn the rules. And then life started in a back-to-back series of, of sort of companies and events and things that puts me where I am today.
Let's talk about those back-to-back companies and how they evolved, and ultimately we'll get to Sprinklr. So could you talk about the startup you were with
Yeah.
When you graduated Stern, and then the progression to ultimately founding Sprinklr?
Yeah, absolutely. So 1999, like 2000, some of you may remember, most of you won't know what the dot-com bubble was. So we had a massive, exuberant economy fueled by the growth of the internet that just burst. And there were literally companies that were worth 10, 20, 100, $500 billion that just went bust. It came down to a fraction of what they were. So at that time, I was I was consulting and I was building the product for a dot-com startup. And they were trying to sell DVDs over the internet, sort of what Netflix eventually came. There's a lesson there about timing and understanding market readiness. But obviously, they'd gone public, they had money in the bank, but wasn't going anywhere. So one of the co-founders and so at that time, I was building an email marketing platform for this company. And this company obviously wasn't gonna go anywhere in a hurry, if go anywhere at all. So one of the folks who originally founded the company and I jumped out and created this B2B email marketing platform. And we spun that out as a company. It was called Advaya. It was a Sanskrit word that means not second ever. And that was the real first startup experience that we started going door to door, trying to convince people that they can use email to do what they were doing with direct mail. In India, if you remember back in the day, we would go out, fetch mail from our mailbox, post box, like you would come back home with this thick coupons and flyers and direct mail and direct marketing stuff. And, fast forward several companies, we played a role in moving a lot of that to electronic communications. And that really was my first startup. Along the way, I met someone who was trying to get into email marketing. And I paired up with that person and a couple others to create what became sort of the second startup. And that went on to become, at one point, rated highest in among email marketing and commercial email platforms. We sold that in 2005 to a publicly traded company called Alliance Data Systems and their Epsilon division. And I joined there. I was the CTO, the guy building everything in the startup side. And after selling the company, I became the president of Epsilon Interactive. We acquired a couple of our competitors along the way, and arguably Epsilon Interactive at that time was the largest email marketing company. And at that time, we were sending 48 billion emails, if I remember right, that year. And that was on behalf of all banks. And, if you signed up for a newsletter from Target or whatever, we were the ones sending that. If you had a Capital One credit card and your payment was due, you got an email. We were the ones sending that. And I had realized I was trying to solve the problems with commercial email. And email it was a great channel, but it was amusing to see spam go crazy and us trying to solve the challenges of a technology medium like email through legislation. So the way we solved that in 2003 and later was, most of you may not remember it, spam was a big deal. And so we passed the can spam legislation as a country. And then the technology started getting better. And together, that's how spam got under control. And so as we were trying to get, hey, your payment is due message from your bank through the Nigerian scammers email, trying to get you to give your credit card, it was very noisy and messy. And I always thought there had to be an elegant, and I'm a product person, I'm a technologist, right? I was always looking for an elegant way to solve the problems of email at scale, because email didn't have permissions. There was no way to differentiate messages. And there was no way to really support photos and videos inside email back then. It was all attachments. I'm like, we're moving to a world where people are going to share photos and videos. So it was obvious to me that this had to be addressed. I was trying to create the next generation of email. And I look around and I find Facebook and Twitter and YouTube all growing like crazy. And when I looked at the pattern across all of those new channels that were growing crazy, it was like it's solving all the problems I had with email. And what I had done was I had developed a business platform for large global companies to use email as a channel. And suddenly there were, 5 or 10 new channels that consumers were using that had solved the problems of email.
I'm sorry. Before you go to Sprinklr, I want to back up a little bit and I want to get into the trenches with you with that company that you sold in 2005 and talk a little bit about how that company was built. It can be a real slog, knocking on doors, trying to get clients and customers to sign up. Talk about that process, about what it took to build that first company before we get to Sprinklr.
Yeah, it's the story of my life. So I remember in 2001, 2002, going into CMO's offices and going into marketing organizations and telling them they got to move money to email and they got to cut down the direct mail budgets, move it to email. And people going, what email? What do you mean? Like, email's very personal. I don't think people want commercial email. AOL is what I use to connect to my friends. And I'm like, no, it's just a new way to communicate. And we're consumers are, we got to follow. And I vividly remember I was meeting with the CEO of a very large direct marketing company. And at that time, there was back then, billion-dollar companies were a big deal. And these guys were very, very big. I'm not going to name them. But the CEO literally threw me out of the office. And I told him, your business is going to get decimated. You've got to get into email. And he said, great, get out of my office. Uh, and and so it's just being relentless. And sure enough, you bet on, I'm a very thesis driven person. Uh, I'm not into fads. I believe in fundamentals constantly. It's very hard to believe and stay with the fundamentals when the world around you gets all wrapped up, in SPACs and Bitcoin. It's great. They might all do very well. I just don't know how to use them. And I'm a guy who feels guilty if I didn't kind of earn something the hard way. And so this was a long-term bet with the business that said email was going to be big. It worked out. Same thing with Sprinklr.
So, all right. So it wasn't easy because you were basically on the edge of a technology. So a good portion of your selling had to involve educating in this case because you were kind of blazing a trail that was not fully appreciated by your potential clients. Can you tell us who was the big fish that you landed and you knew that you were off to the races and you felt vindicated?
Cynthia, I've often said this. When I was 20, I wanted to change the world. When I was 40, I never wanted to change the world. I wanted to be ahead in a changing world. So let me repeat that. I want to be ahead in a changing world. Know that the world's going to catch up. Going back to my email days, there are always momentous wins. I remember winning the Capital One account, which I think we co-created lots of things that are like routine in email marketing today, like marketing automation. Capital One at that time, if I remember right, was the world's possibly largest direct marketing infrastructure. They were sending so much direct mail that I believe the Postmaster General gave them a separate rate, and that a lot of that messaging, they were very sophisticated in direct marketing, so we had to do segmentation automation, connect to the internal system. So there are always this distinct memorable wins, but when you're doing a startup, you have to remember that it's a marathon that never ends. So when you do it for the first time, you're like, yes, I know my business is going to work. I don't think so. I wake up today going like, listen, what are the existential threats for my business? And you have to take a 5-10 year view and just keep flowing through. So those moments are yours to celebrate, to cherish. But you're terribly mistaken, I think, if you think that's it. I landed a customer, now I'm on my path. There are no paths. It's like a game. You constantly get knocked off, constantly. And you got to get used to it. At some point, you go, okay, this is how it works. And then the game is getting back on your foot every time.
Now, biz dev is always that's one piece of this. The other piece that founders spend a lot of time on is on raising money. So did you have that as well going on, or were you funded by outside investors? How was that venture funded?
Yeah, so much so that I realized we didn't do it right the first time. We had some pretty spectacular big names investing in the company. I'll tell you what I've learned about raising money. When you go to anyone with a big idea and you want their money, you're one of, I don't know, 1 million people doing the same. If you chase what you really believe in and you give it everything you've gotten, It cannot go wrong, because if you're successful, those people will find you and they will pitch you. If it's not successful, you're better off losing your money than somebody else's, because you're not answerable to anyone. Which is why I didn't take funding through Sprinklr for 2 years when I started it. I was funding it myself. I don't understand entrepreneurs who go just raise money in the beginning, because you're telling me you don't have conviction to worth enough to risk what you have. So we learned from our early experiences. We took more money than we should have. Sometimes the worst thing you can do is take money when you don't have a choice. And when you do that, you totally dilute the company and your cap table gets messy. So I took a lot of those learnings and applied it to Sprinklr. But here's my philosophy in raising money. It is focus on the business. And it depends on whether you're building a lifestyle business or a large company. If you have aspirations to build a large company, all I know how to do is give it everything I've got to prove that it works. And I know if I'm really successful, I'm going to be on the radar of everybody with money, because they're all competing to get into the best company. So I just obsess about creating an amazing company, and then they find me.
All right, Ragy. So evidently you didn't get the memo that you're supposed to have an idea, develop your deck, and go get money for it.
Yeah, Cynthia, my brain doesn't work that way. My brain refuses to plead for attention. If you make me want to come pitch you, my brain goes, I'm going to be too big that you can't ignore me. So that's just, maybe I'm wired off. I mean, there are a bunch of things wrong with me, I know. Sometimes I can't hear the word no when people say it. This is another one. People, even now, they tell me pitch Sprinklr. I'm like, I have no pitch. I literally walked away from one of the big name West Coast VC conference rooms. The guy said, me. I'd flown 6 hours to go meet him. He said, I don't want to pitch you. I shut my laptop down. He said, no, go ahead, pitch me. He said, I have no pitch. I'm building a company. Are you asking me to explain what I believe in? He said, no, pitch me. He said, I won't pitch you. I shut down, got up to leave. And he was exasperated. So he said, no, tell me your story. And I opened my laptop and I think that meeting was doomed in the first 3 minutes. I didn't care.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now Sprinklr, you have 3 companies now under your belt when you sell and you are looking for the next thing to do, which you already have in mind because you see analogies in how email evolved and what was happening with social media. Okay, and you decided you're going to fund this out of your own pocket. You have a young family. That's a lot to take on, but you do it. So talk about Sprinklr and the lessons that you learned and brought into this and how you were able to get Sprinklr up and running and off the ground.
So it's now 2008 when I start seeing this very clearly around me. And I remember I'm single threaded and I told you in the beginning, I'm good. So there I am. I'm the president of Epsilon Interactive. Life is good. I've got money in the bank to support my family for one generation. I'm like, this is good. I'm not very ambitious. I wasn't planning to buy islands or planes. So life is good, and we just gotten out of a whole bunch of things. And it was very, very, very intense. I've said this publicly. I used to throw up from stress. Imagine showing up in a new country when you're 21 and just having to learn everything and trying to do this and having literally knowing no one. And so I had to figure out how to learn about the mind and manage and control that. So when you have the storm blow over and it's all calm, and you realize that you actually enjoyed the storm, there's a part of you that goes, shit, that was the part. And I remember when we were doing this startup, the email startup,
we had no money, man. We had no money. There were situations where we didn't have money sometimes to just, we were not sure whether we'll be able to make payroll. And so we dreamt of becoming big, having a real office. I've said this story also before where we used to be in this not so great New York buildings, which are many of them. And we had one elevator. So you had to wait so long for the elevator every day. I'm like, someday we're going to be big. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have our own elevator. I will walk up, look at the sign of the building outside and go, someday we're going to have our sign up there. And after we sold the business, we had 2 floors. We had our own elevator. We put a sign up. And you would walk up all the way in. I remember I'm out of my office and I'd see new faces. I'm like, I don't know these people. We were hiring so many people. Don't know these people. And you realize what you dreamt of and wanted wasn't really what you were going to enjoy. Your dream wasn't what you wanted it to be. And so you start rewinding the tape and you go, oh, my best years when we're down in trenches solving large problems, which is around the time when all of this was happening. And I wasn't really planning to start a new company. So I went to that Epsilon, I went and said, like, the person I was working for at that time, in a corporate job, I said, hey, we got to get into social media, which was a term at that time. And rightfully, he asked me, like, how much revenue is that going to be this year? Because I'm running a P&L. And I'm like, this is not about how much revenue is this year. You see these movies that play out inevitably. And that's sort of the founding story behind Sprinklr. And I took everything I had learned. And in a few years, had the corporate job. I also realized that, once you're an entrepreneur, you can't go back. Your brain doesn't process instructions very well. And so I had started creating sort of my laws and rules of what a next generation company should look like. And we've tried to apply a lot of that to Sprinklr.
Did you sell a portion of your ownership of Epsilon? So when you say you use your own money to start Sprinklr, where did that funding come from?
So we had sold the startup. We sold for $120 million to Epsilon. Okay, and there was a lot of VCs in, but there's enough for us to come out of that pretty decent. So that was my investment capital. So that was not, and my wife and I still argue about this. But I remember coming home one day and saying, like, look, I'm going to start another company. And I remember her breaking down and crying, so we can't do this again. We just got out of it. And rightfully so, little kids, all of that. And by the way, on record, she completely denies it. So the jury's out on the truth there. But when she stopped, I said, look, I'm going to make it worse. I'm going to fund it myself. That was a double head. But Sprinklr wasn't started to prove a point. It wasn't started to. Sometimes when you start from an even place like that, I think there is a lot more nobility and grace in the founding emotions, because when I was doing my previous, it was necessity. We had to do it. And this allowed us to kind of dream a lot bigger and just do it our way.
So when you started Sprinklrs, in terms of your team, did you pull people from Epsilon? How were these folks that you had been working with in previous ventures? How did you get that going?
Not really. Although that appears like the thing to do. I had made many of the people that were with me in my previous startups unaffordable to me. When you start bootstrapping, right? You also realize quickly that when you go back into the warfront cold and alone, you can't blame anyone. People are settled, they're making good money. It's a big leap for them to now take a pay cut and expose themselves and their families and extended families to the risk that they spent 10 years getting out of. And just because I wanted to do it, I was going to do it. It was not fair for me, and I couldn't afford many of my previous, because once a company gets bigger, salaries catch up, and we pay market or above market. I always believe in amazing A+ talents. So we couldn't afford them, so I had to go back and just really. We started Sprinklr from a spare bedroom of mine. The servers were in the basement. We built it back up. There were a few people, handful of people that had joined. Um, it was built again from the ground up.
Okay, so here you are. You've started Sprinklr, and why don't we talk a little bit for those who may not know what a customer experience management platform is and what it does. Who uses Sprinklr, and what do they do with it?
So let's answer the question of who uses Sprinklr, just so that the context becomes easy. So we work with over 1,000 of the world's largest, biggest companies. We work with 9 of the 10 of the world's most valuable brands. We work with over 50% of the Fortune 100. These are companies like Microsoft and P&G and Nike. And you can just literally take any industry, look at the top companies, chances are most of them are our clients. Wells Fargo, most banks. Again, I'm not going to go into the details and specifics, but that's who our clients are. And what we do for them is we give them an enterprise software platform that they can deploy around the world in all business units to do all customer-facing functions across all modern channels. So let me break it down. We give them a platform to do customer care, to do marketing, to do advertising, to do customer engagement and research across 24 social channels, 10 messaging platforms. So it's everybody from Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Renren and QQ and WeK and Line and Apple Message, Google Message, Facebook Messenger, like all of those, TikTok, all of those. And so literally we help them adapt their customer facing functions to the modern world. Well, let me play it back in a way that be easier for us to understand as consumers. You go give a 1-star review to a product on Amazon, or you go on Twitter and say, oh my God, my flight sucked. Or my flight got canceled, what do I do? Or you say, hey, I wish Samsung did this with their product. All of those get processed by our platform on the other end. We suck in all the data. We use AI to understand what that is, understand what needs to be routed to customer care, what's the marketing opportunity, what are your competitors doing. And on the other side, I've got marketing teams, customer care teams, and research teams, and sales teams all logging into Sprinklr, and we connect all these platforms using APIs. And they do customer care like they do in a contact center, or they do marketing like they do with other channels. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. There's a wonderful story that I've heard you tell about a lunch, I believe it was, that you had with a friend and a mentor, I guess, who early on, he asked you, where do you see this going? I think it was Carlos Dominguez, if I'm not mistaken. Could you share that? Because what you took away from that conversation, and it was such an interesting turning point. Could you share that story?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we sold Bigfoot Interactive was sold for $120 million. It's all public data. And so when I started on my own, 2 years into it, a year and a half, 2 years, we're going about building it. And I meet Carlos, who was a client at that time at Cisco. It took interest in this platform and in social media, where it was going. We ended up meeting in Jersey, and he asked me, what are you planning to do with the company? And I hadn't really thought about what I was planning to do with the company. So I told him, I think I'll build another $100 million company out of this. And I was hoping this time we'll do it much better and cleaner than before. And then he said to me, he leaned back and he said, "This is not $100 million company." And, and I think if you watch the movie, the Facebook movie, movie about Facebook and its story, there's a moment like this where Sean Parker says the same thing. So he said it's $1 billion company. So I'm like, what? And I leaned back, and there were a couple other things that happened that were signals from my customers, which is always my truth. I always say the truth lies in the world that customers live in, how they use your product, nothing else. So there's a bunch of those things in that time period. This was, I think, 2012, late 2011, 2012. Now that's a couple of years into founding the company. That I went, man, the change is not that there are new channels. The change is that consumers are in control and there's a lot more data. So the three ahas behind Sprinklr is, number one, there are more channels today and there will be. So there are 34 modern channels that we support and there's more coming. These channels connect consumers to each other and they're putting so much information out there. 4.6 billion people are connected. This data is never going to go into your CRM system because this is unstructured. You don't own this data, consumers own this data. So there are more channels, there's more data. And because people are connected to each other and because people have put so much information about themselves out there, they are in control. Like nobody buys anything without reading a review. So marketing and advertising and care all have to change. And so this is the aha moment that happened in 2012 that made me go, okay, I think this is going to be bigger, and let's go approach it that way. And we raised some money and got on a merry path.
We have several questions I want to be sure that we take. One of which is about a broad question about the future of startups, entrepreneurship in New York City. And so if we can have you switch gears a little bit and focus a little bit more on the macro, would you advise other startups to start in New York City? And I guess this is about the local ecosystem here.
Yeah, so I'm on the board of Tech NYC, which our charter is to try and help businesses thrive in New York City and startups, technology companies. All my startups have been here. I believe New York is an amazing place to start a company. I love the Valley, but if I'm going to start a company, I wouldn't want to be in the Valley competing with everyone else for talent on technology. I would want to be closer to my customers. I wouldn't want to be closer to where I can find all kinds of talent, not just tech talent. And I think New York is the place to be for that. I mean, it's easier to get to Europe if you're thinking about a global company for a variety of reasons. I think New York brings a very different kind of energy as compared to the Valley, and I love it. I love having this diversity. I love having that energy, and I love being close to our clients.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question. Actually, there's several, so that we're going to bounce around a little bit topically, if it's okay with you. Does Sprinklr work with smaller companies? So we know you have major brands, Cisco, Microsoft, Prada. There's all kinds of brands that you've worked with. Do you work with smaller companies?
Well, the truthful answer is any size company can use Sprinklr, but frankly, it's not the best fit for smaller companies. So if you have a smaller business, you're better off finding a vendor or a partner who's built their platform for a smaller business. We've built a platform for businesses that are at scale. So I would say, no, we're not probably a good fit today for a small company.
Got it. All right. Now here's a question I did not have on my pages of lists. The artwork behind you, it is very beautiful. Is there a story behind it that you could share?
You notice that if you surround yourself with unpleasant people or busy, noisy environment, your brain gets cloudy and noisy. The inverse is true. I think if you surround yourself with things that emanate peace and calm and help you. So I've tried to consciously and intentionally create um, environments where my brain's reinforced with signals of peace and calm. So this, by the way, is a super inexpensive piece of art that I picked up that I loved because it was very raw. And I'm a non-practicing Buddhist, but I embrace that. There's so many things about Buddhism that I love, um, and someone that has who's been meditating and seeking sort of deeper truths about life for about 20 years. It's profoundly impactful for me. So it's a cheap piece of art that just suited my energy and what I get. So I put it up there. It's amazing how many compliments I get.
It's beautiful. Okay, and I want to use that because I've seen you speak before, even at Stern, and there's a bit of a philosopher in you that always comes through, and so I was interested in, as is someone in the audience, about your philosophy around hiring, the culture that you create at Sprinklr. I know that's very important to you. Could you talk about that? Because that's often something that a lot of startups don't get right. It's hard to get it right.
We kind of talk about my personal philosophy, and obviously it's bled into Sprinklr, and it's a cornerstone to how we think. Um, the singular word that sort of I try to live my life by is the word happier. It's not happy, it's happier. There's a lot of people chase happiness and just end up in terrible places in situations. I think happiness is complicated. Life is complicated. Happiness is very subjective. But if you instead focus on being happier, you know that's something you can strive for any minute. I don't care how happy you are. I think you can be happier. I don't care how miserable you are, how bad things are. Things can get happier. So that challenges you to start thinking about what makes you happy. Most people really don't spend time thinking about it. And I think that's a mistake. You got to think about what makes you happy. What makes you happier? What direction should you be going in? And once you know that, you chase it. So that's kind of the cornerstone phrase and framing behind Sprinkler's thinking. We're trying to create the world's most loved enterprise software company. What does that mean? We want to do what Zappos did in retail in enterprise software. And if you know anything about enterprise software, people don't associate a lot of love with enterprise software. And we want to change that. Our mission is to enable every organization on the planet to make their customers happier. Remember, happiness is subjective and life is complicated. But when I'm using a phone, Samsung or Apple can make me happier. When I'm flying and I'm in a United flight, they can make me happier or they can ruin my day. So this notion of making software to help organizations make their customers happier is what we're about. How do you make people happier? First, you have to show up. Second, you have to listen. Third, you have to work across all your faculties to create better experiences and better interactions with them. So that's what we do at the company. Our culture can be abstracted into three things. We obsess about customers. We're kind of like Amazon that way. We treat each other like family. And we hire people who take pride in their work intrinsically. I'm looking for people who sense like they take pride in craftsmanship. So they're the kind of people who make their bed and walk around it to check, not because they're getting points for it or they're going to be recognized, because that's who they are, and a reflection of who they are, they see in their work. So those are the core tenets. It's a lot more. We call it the Sprinklr way. It's very public. You can Google it and you can find a lot of information. But I'd say these three are sort of our culture trademarks.
A question regarding, do you wish you had a co-founder when you founded Sprinklr?
No, I've been on that journey. Well, I think the co-founders make a lot of sense for a lot of people. It did not make sense for me. Ultimately, when I started Sprinklr, I did have a vision, and there were a lot of things that led me to be convinced when I finally got started with Sprinklr. Say, you know what, you have to, because it's just I didn't want to. I didn't want the idea to be diluted. I didn't want to the purity and the sanctity of what we are trying to do and the kind of company that we're trying to create. There was a point in my life I said, I'm not going to debate that. I'm not going to negotiate, compromise on that. So it didn't make sense for me at all.
Wow, this time went so quickly. Could you share in 30 seconds or less some piece of advice for those out there who either are starting or thinking about starting a business, a venture, that you could share? Something that you'd like them to take away from your journey?
I'll leave you all with one. It's the one that most profoundly changed my life was this. This was one of my early startup days where, I was working for someone before, actually, I was just about to get into the startup world. And the person I was working for was a very talented mathematician, PhD, superstar. Uh, and he said to me once, I used to just constantly be thinking about, oh, I'm doing all this work. I did this. I didn't sleep all night. I coded for 6 hours straight. I didn't take a break. I wrote this. I did that. And once I interrupted him when he was doing something very personal and important to him. He snapped, turned around and said, activity doesn't matter, results do. And he was going somewhere. So he was outside in a cold New York day at the street. He was trying to get a cab. And I'm like, And I thought it was so impactful. And there he says these two lines. He was dressed up for a party. He gets in the cab, slams the door. And I'm sitting there, standing there going, this is down by, if you could visualize downtown, man, it was just like, I could feel the breeze hit from the water. I'm like, it doesn't matter, outcomes do. And it changed my life. That was the last time I celebrated what I did.
Ragy Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today. You're very inspiring, and I hope that the audience, I know that the audience is taking away quite a bit from you. So thank you so much. I want to also thank everyone that joined us today. I encourage you, on the Sprinklr website, there's some wonderful case stories about studies about how the company functions. There's a lot of information out there, and it's an interesting company to look at. So you should check it out. I'm just curious, Ragy, by any chance, for those MBAs, it's that season. Are you hiring?
We're hiring quite aggressively. It's very specialized roles, but I would encourage you to look at the job section. This year, I think we have to hire like 1,000 people. So please look us up, and if you find something interesting, apply.
Good, wonderful. So thank you again, and take good care.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Good luck, everyone.